In a courtroom where justice was meant to reign supreme, Judge Richard Bryant silenced a young woman with the harsh bang of his gavel. "Case dismissed," he announced with finality, his eyes never meeting those of the survivor who had summoned the courage to speak. But he couldn't have known that across town, Usha Vance was reviewing the case file, her determined eyes narrowing as she uncovered a pattern that would shake the very foundations of the judicial system. Comment where you're watching from today, because this story of corruption, courage, and the fight for justice is one that resonates no matter where you call home. The prestigious law offices of Hendricks and Sullivan gleamed under the morning sun, the polished marble floors reflecting light that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. The hushed atmosphere conveyed power and privilege, a place where legal battles were won with whispers rather than shouts. Among the senior partners and associates moving purposefully through the hallways, Usha Vance stood out not because she demanded attention, but because she commanded respect. Her modest office contrasted with the opulence around her, walls lined with law books rather than expensive art, and a desk covered with case files rather than status symbols. A simple photograph of her family was the only personal touch in a space dedicated to the pursuit of justice. Usha's reputation preceded her, a brilliant legal mind who had walked away from a lucrative corporate law career to focus on representing survivors of abuse. Her colleagues had initially dismissed her decision as idealistic naivete, but her string of victories in seemingly unwinnable cases had silenced the skeptics. Today she was reviewing a file that had found its way to her through unconventional channels. A case dismissed by Judge Richard Bryant that on the surface appeared to be a routine decision. But Usha had noticed something others had missed, a pattern in Bryant's rulings that suggested something far more sinister than judicial discretion. Daniel Miller, the firm's managing partner, paused at her open door. "Usha, we need to talk about your caseload. The partners are concerned that you're not bringing in the kind of revenue that justifies my continued employment here." Usha finished his sentence without looking up from the file. "I'm aware of the concerns, Daniel. I'll address them at the next partners meeting." Miller hesitated, his expensive suit and carefully cultivated appearance a stark contrast to Usha's practical attire. "It's not just about revenue. It's about the firm's reputation. These cases you're taking on, they're not the kind of high-profile matters that enhance our standing." Now Usha looked up, her gaze direct and unwavering. "Isn't justice the ultimate enhancement of any law firm's standing? Or have I misunderstood our purpose?" "You know what I mean," Miller replied, his voice lowering. "Judge Bryant called me personally about this latest case you're pursuing. He's a powerful man, Usha. The firm can't afford to antagonize him." "Interesting that he would call you," Usha said, her tone measured and calm. "What exactly did he say that has you so concerned?" Miller shifted uncomfortably. "He suggested that pursuing this matter further would be unwise for all parties involved." "Including the survivor who was denied justice?" Usha asked, placing a hand on the file in front of her. "Or just unwise for those who prefer to maintain the status quo?" "You're putting me in an impossible position," Miller protested, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was overhearing their conversation. "No, Daniel. Judge Bryant has put you in an impossible position by asking you to obstruct justice," Usha replied. "And now you're attempting to pass that burden on to me. I respectfully decline to accept it." The tension between them was palpable, an invisible force that seemed to expand to fill the modest office. Miller's expression shifted from discomfort to resignation. "The firm will not be able to support you on this, Usha. If you pursue this case, you do so as a private citizen, not as a representative of Hendricks and Sullivan." Usha nodded, unsurprised. "I understand, and I accept those terms." As Miller turned to leave, Usha called after him, Daniel, one question. How many other attorneys has Judge Bryant contacted about cases involving his court? Miller paused, his back to her. I wouldn't know. But you'd be concerned if the answer was many, wouldn't you? Usha pressed. He didn't respond, continuing down the hallway as if he hadn't heard her. Usha returned her attention to the file, her resolve only strengthened by the encounter. What had begun as a single troubling case was quickly revealing itself to be something far more systematic. Later that afternoon, Usha met with Amanda Kim, the young woman whose case had been dismissed by Judge Bryant. They sat in a small coffee shop several blocks from the courthouse, away from the prying eyes of the legal community. I don't understand, Amanda said, her hands wrapped tightly around her cup. The evidence was there, the police report, the medical records, the witnesses. How could he just dismiss it all? That's what I intend to find out, Usha replied, her voice gentle but firm. Your case isn't the only one Judge Bryant has handled this way. There's a pattern, and patterns can be exposed. Amanda looked up, hope and fear battling in her eyes. But he's a judge. People trust him. Who's going to believe me over him? The truth doesn't require belief to exist, Usha said. It only requires the courage of those willing to speak it. Are you still willing to fight for yours? Amanda took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening almost imperceptibly. Yes, but I'm scared. After the dismissal, I received messages, warnings to let it go. Usha's expression remained calm, but her eyes hardened. May I see them? Amanda pulled out her phone, scrolling through to show Usha the series of texts from an unknown number. Each one was carefully worded to avoid explicit threats, while making the intent perfectly clear: silence or consequences. Have you shown these to the police? Usha asked, already knowing the answer. Amanda gave a hollow laugh. The detective said they were too vague to be considered threats, that I was being paranoid. You're not paranoid, Amanda. You're being intimidated, Usha said firmly, and intimidation is the tool of those who fear exposure. As they continued their conversation, Usha noticed a man at a nearby table who seemed too interested in his newspaper and not interested enough in his cooling coffee. Christopher Quinn, a private investigator known to work for high-profile clients, including several judges. Usha made a mental note of his presence, but gave no indication she had recognized him. Here's what we're going to do, Usha said, leaning forward and lowering her voice. I'm going to connect you with Chelsea Johnson. She runs a survivor advocacy group that can provide support and resources. And then we're going to start building a case not just about your experience, but about the pattern of cases Judge Bryant has dismissed under similar circumstances. Is that even possible? Amanda asked. Going after a judge? Difficult, yes. Impossible, no, Usha replied. The judicial system has mechanisms for accountability, even if those mechanisms are rarely used. Our challenge will be finding others willing to come forward. The following day, Usha arranged a meeting with Brandon Clark, an investigative journalist whose work had exposed corruption in various institutions. They met in a park, walking along a path that provided both privacy and the assurance that they weren't being recorded. Judge Richard Bryant, Brandon mused after Usha had outlined her concerns. He's been on my radar for a while, but I haven't been able to crack the story. His connections run deep. Mayor, police chief, district attorney, they're all part of the same social circles, the same political machinery. That machinery is crushing people like Amanda Kim, Usha said. And based on the pattern I'm seeing in his case dismissals, she's far from the only one. Brandon nodded thoughtfully. I've heard rumors about financial irregularities too. Properties purchased through shell companies, investments that pay out remarkably well. Nothing concrete enough to publish. Could we combine our efforts? Usha suggested. Your investigation into the financial aspects, my focus on the pattern of judicial misconduct. It would be risky, Brandon warned. Bryant isn't just powerful in his own right. He has the backing of Kyle Murphy and the entire Murphy Development Group. They've bankrolled half the city council's campaigns. And the connection between a real estate developer and a judge who consistently dismisses cases against certain defendants doesn't strike you as worthy of investigation? Usha asked, raising an eyebrow. A slow smile spread across Brandon's face. When you put it that way, it sounds like exactly the kind of story I live for. But we'll need more than patterns and suspicions. We'll need documentation, testimony, irrefutable evidence. That's where I'm hoping you can help, Usha said. My resources are limited, especially now that I'm pursuing this without my firm's backing. Brandon stopped walking, turning to face her directly. They cut you loose over this? Let's just say, we've agreed that my pursuit of this matter is a personal endeavor, not a professional one, Usha replied diplomatically. Cowards, Brandon muttered. Well, their loss is journalism's gain. I have some contacts who might be willing to help. Court clerks, paralegals, people who see the inner workings of Bryant's courtroom. And I've been cultivating a source in the county recorder's office who might be able to help with the property records. Perfect, Usha said. I'll focus on finding more survivors willing to speak about their experiences with Judge Bryant's court. Together, we might be able to build enough momentum to overcome the resistance we're bound to face. As they parted ways, Usha felt both the weight of the challenge ahead and the first stirrings of hope. What had begun as a single case of injustice was expanding into an investigation that could expose corruption at the highest levels of the city's power structure. That evening, as Usha reviewed her notes in her apartment, her phone rang with an unknown number. She answered cautiously. Ms. Vance, a disguised voice said, I understand you've been asking questions about Judge Richard Bryant. Who is this? Usha asked, her voice steady despite the unexpected call. Someone who knows what you're looking for, the voice replied. Check your email in 5 minutes, and Ms. Vance, be careful who you trust. The call ended abruptly. Precisely 5 minutes later, an email arrived from an anonymous address containing a single file, a spreadsheet detailing a series of property transactions involving shell companies. A note at the bottom read simply, follow the money from Murphy Development Group through these entities to offshore accounts controlled by Bryant. Usha stared at the screen, her mind racing. This was either a genuine lead from a whistleblower or an elaborate trap designed to discredit her investigation before it gained traction. Either way, it confirmed one thing. Her questions had struck a nerve, and powerful people were now paying attention. As she began cross-referencing the information in the spreadsheet with public records, Usha knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. Judge Bryant and his allies would use every tool at their disposal to silence her, just as they had silenced Amanda Kim and countless others. But Usha Vance had spent her career giving voice to the silenced, and she wasn't about to stop now. Not when the pursuit of justice had never been more important. The morning headlines sent shockwaves through the city. Questions raised about Judge Bryant's dismissal record. Brendan Clark's article, while carefully worded to avoid direct accusations, presented the statistical anomalies in Bryant's court with devastating precision. Cases involving certain defendants, particularly those with connections to Kyle Murphy's development empire, were dismissed at a rate that defied coincidence. Usha Vance was quoted only briefly, noting that patterns in judicial decision-making deserve scrutiny when they appear to favor specific interests. It was a measured statement, but the implications were clear to anyone paying attention. Judge Bryant's response came swiftly. By mid-morning, he had called a press conference on the courthouse steps, his imposing figure framed perfectly against the classical columns of justice. These insinuations are not only false, but represent a dangerous attack on judicial independence, Bryant declared. his voice carrying the practiced authority that had intimidated countless witnesses over the years. Decisions in my courtroom are based solely on the law and the evidence presented. Any suggestion otherwise is an affront to the legal system that protects us all. Behind him stood a carefully assembled group of supporters, prominent attorneys, like Justin Schmidt DDS and Veronica Rich MD, who had won cases in his court, along with city council members whose campaigns had benefited from Murphy Development Group's generous contributions. Their presence was meant to convey solidarity, but to Usha's trained eye, it merely confirmed the network of influence she was beginning to unravel. As Bryant continued his denunciation of the irresponsible journalism and politically motivated attacks, Usha received a text from Brandon. He's rattled. Notice he's not addressing the specific dismissal rates. Indeed, Bryant's forceful rhetoric avoided engaging with the statistical evidence presented in the article. Instead, he pivoted to his record of public service and community involvement, listing charitable boards and civic organizations as if they were shields against accountability. Across town, in a modest apartment that had become the unofficial headquarters of their investigation, Usha met with Melanie Reynolds, a former court clerk who had worked in Bryant's courtroom for 3 years before requesting a transfer. "I couldn't put my finger on it at first," Melanie explained, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "Just a feeling that something wasn't right. Then I started noticing the pattern in how he handled certain cases, how his demeanor would shift, how he'd find technicalities to exclude key evidence." "Did you ever report your concerns?" Usha asked. Melanie's bitter laugh answered before her words did. To whom? The court administrator who owed his job to Bryant? The Judicial Ethics Committee, filled with judges who golf with Bryant every Sunday? I tried once, very cautiously, to mention it to my supervisor. The next day, I found myself reassigned to filing duty in the basement archives. And now, Usha pressed gently. "Why come forward now?" "Because of Amanda Kim," Melanie said, her voice strengthening. "I was there for her case. I saw the evidence. I watched Judge Bryant systematically dismantle her testimony, undermine the medical reports, give the defense attorney extraordinary latitude while restricting the prosecutor at every turn. It was," she paused, searching for the right word, "choreographed, like he'd decided the outcome before the first argument was even presented." Usha made careful notes as Melanie continued, describing specific techniques Bryant employed to steer cases toward his preferred outcomes: subtle intimidation of certain witnesses, inconsistent application of evidentiary rules, strategic recesses that disrupted the prosecution's momentum. "Would you be willing to make a formal statement?" Usha asked when Melanie had finished. The former clerk hesitated. "What would happen? To me, my career would be over." "Possibly," Usha acknowledged, refusing to sugarcoat the reality. "But your testimony could help ensure that Amanda Kim and others like her finally receive justice. And you wouldn't be standing alone." By evening, Usha's phone was buzzing constantly with messages from other courthouse employees, survivors whose cases had been dismissed under questionable circumstances, even attorneys who had privately questioned Bryant's rulings but had remained silent to protect their professional standing. Brandon's article had created a crack in the wall of silence, and now the pressure behind it was forcing that crack wider. Not all the responses were supportive. Daniel Miller called from the law firm, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The partners have voted, Usha. Your employment with Hendricks and Sullivan is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to clear out your office tomorrow morning." "I understand," Usha replied calmly. "And the official reason?" "Violation of firm policy regarding public statements without prior approval," Daniel said, "though we both know this goes beyond a quote in a newspaper." "Indeed it does," Usha agreed. "It goes to the heart of what we claim to stand for as attorneys. I'd expected better, Daniel." There was a long pause before he responded, his voice lower now. "For what it's worth, I abstained from the vote. And be careful, Usha. Judge Bryant has friends in places you wouldn't expect." The warning echoed one she'd already received from Thomas Hayes, a detective with the police department who had reached out through secure channels. "They're building a case against you," Hayes had told her during a brief, furtive meeting in a downtown parking garage. "Nothing substantive. Ethics violations, procedural complaints, anything they can use to discredit you before this goes further." "Who's they?" Usha had asked. "Higher than my pay grade," Hayes replied. "But the orders are coming through channels that usually only activate for major criminal investigations, not disputes with local judges." This information had confirmed Usha's suspicion that Judge Bryant's protection extended beyond local politics into state and possibly federal power structures. The question was why? What made this particular judge so valuable to so many powerful interests? The answer began to emerge the following day, when Brandon published his follow-up article, this one tracing the complex web of financial transactions between Murphy Development Group and offshore entities that eventually led back to accounts linked to Judge Bryant. Over the past 5 years, the article detailed, properties involved in contentious legal battles appeared before Judge Bryant's court. In each case, his rulings favored developers who later sold the properties to shell companies at below-market rates. These same properties were subsequently resold at significantly higher values, with the profits flowing through a series of transactions that obscured their ultimate destination, accounts connected to the judge himself. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Local television stations led their evening broadcasts with the story. Social media exploded with calls for investigation. The courthouse became surrounded by protesters demanding Bryant's resignation. And then came the counterattack. Usha was in the middle of a meeting with Amanda Kim and 3 other survivors when her phone exploded with notifications. A press release from the State Bar Association announced an emergency ethics investigation into Usha Vance for alleged witness tampering, evidence manipulation, and unauthorized practice of law since her termination from Hendricks and Sullivan. Simultaneously, Bryant held another press conference, this time with the District Attorney Stephen Vasquez at his side. These fabricated accusations represent a coordinated attempt to undermine public faith in our judicial system, Bryant declared, his previous composure replaced by righteous indignation. "Ms. Vance has allegedly coached witnesses to make false statements against me and has potentially violated numerous ethical standards in her vendetta against this court." The district attorney stepped forward, his expression grave. "My office takes these allegations extremely seriously. We have opened an investigation into Ms. Vance's conduct and will be interviewing all parties involved in this apparent attempt to obstruct justice," Brandon Clark called moments later. "They're trying to flip the script," he said without preamble. "Make you the criminal instead of the whistleblower. Classic intimidation tactic." "Did you see who's leading the Bar Association's ethics committee?" Usha asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "No. Who?" "Michelle Kruger, former law partner of Judge Bryant and current legal counsel for Murphy Development Group," Brandon swore softly. "The conflicts of interest are so blatant, they're not even trying to hide them anymore." "Because they don't think they need to," Usha replied. "They believe they can crush this through sheer institutional force." That evening, as Usha reviewed her options with a small team of supporters who had gathered in Chelsea Johnson's apartment, now their de facto headquarters since Usha's home was being constantly watched, another unexpected ally emerged. Sarah Snyder, Judge Bryant's former clerk from nearly a decade earlier, arrived with a weathered box of documents. "I kept these against all legal and professional obligations," she said, placing the box on the table, "because even then I knew something wasn't right." Inside were meticulous notes documenting Bryant's pattern of judicial misconduct, stretching back years, including communications with developers before cases even reached his courtroom. "This is..." Usha began, leafing through the papers with growing astonishment. "Career suicide." "Probably," Sarah finished for her. "But after seeing Amanda Kim on the news today, talking about how Bryant dismissed her case despite overwhelming evidence, I couldn't stay silent anymore. The documents provided the historical context they needed, showing that what they were uncovering wasn't an anomaly, but a long-standing pattern of corruption. With this evidence, they could demonstrate that Bryant's conduct represented not isolated incidents, but a systematic perversion of justice spanning his entire judicial career. As they organized the materials, a plan began to take shape. Not just to expose Bryant's corruption, but to reveal the entire network that enabled and protected him. It would require coordinating their legal strategy with Brandon's journalistic platform, carefully timing the release of evidence to counter the inevitable attempts to discredit them, and most importantly, preparing the survivors to withstand the scrutiny and pressure they would face. "They'll try to break you," Usha warned Amanda and the others, who had agreed to come forward publicly. "They'll dig through your past, question your character, suggest ulterior motives. Are you prepared for that?" Amanda looked around at the other survivors, drawing strength from their collective presence. "They already tried to silence me once," she said quietly. "I won't let them do it again." The next morning, as Usha prepared to face a bar association, hearing that had been hastily assembled to consider her suspension, she received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a single USB drive and a note that read, "Security camera footage, Bryant's chambers, key dates, not obtained legally, use carefully." The implicit warning was clear. The footage had been obtained through means that would make it inadmissible in court. But in the court of public opinion, if the contents were as damning as the note suggested, they could shift the entire dynamic of the battle ahead. As Usha considered her next move, weighing legal ethics against the pursuit of justice, she realized that this case had evolved beyond a simple exposure of one corrupt judge. It had become a test of the entire system's integrity and of her own commitment to the principles that had guided her career. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either vindicate the survivors and restore faith in the possibility of justice, or demonstrate just how deeply entrenched corruption had become in the institutions meant to protect the vulnerable. Either way, there would be no going back. The security footage changed everything. Viewed in the privacy of Ethan Griffin's cybersecurity office, one of the few places they could be certain wasn't under surveillance, the videos showed Judge Richard Bryant in a series of meetings that shattered any pretense of judicial impartiality. Kyle Murphy appeared in multiple recordings, as did Stephen Vasquez, the district attorney now investigating Usha. In one particularly damning clip, Bryant could be seen accepting an envelope from Murphy just hours before dismissing a case against one of his development projects. "This is explosive," Brandon said, watching the footage for the third time, "but also legally problematic. Whoever obtained this committed several federal crimes, which means we can't use it in court," Usha agreed. "But it confirms what we suspected. Bryant, Murphy, and Vasquez are operating as a coordinated unit. The question is how to legally obtain evidence that proves the same thing." Ethan, who had remained silent throughout their viewing, finally spoke. "The footage shows specific dates and cases. Now that you know exactly what to look for, could you request the official records of those cases? Financial transactions from those dates? Phone records?" The subpoena requests would be denied by any judge in Bryant's circle of influence, Usha pointed out. Unless, Chelsea Johnson interjected, we could get federal attention. These aren't just ethics violations anymore, they're conspiracy, racketeering, possibly even extortion, if Bryant used his position to force property owners to sell to Murphy's companies. The strategy that emerged from that meeting was two-pronged. Continue building their case through legitimate channels while carefully using their knowledge of the video contents to guide their investigation. Brandon would prepare a major exposé, but hold it until they had secured enough legally obtained evidence to withstand the inevitable counterattack. Meanwhile, Usha faced her hearing before the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. As expected, Michelle Kruger led the proceedings with thinly veiled hostility. "Ms. Vance," Kruger began, her voice carrying the artificial concern of someone enjoying their power, "you stand accused of serious violations of professional conduct. How do you respond to the allegations that you coached witnesses to make false statements against Judge Bryant?" Usha stood calmly before the committee. "I categorically deny these allegations. Each witness I've spoken with has provided their testimony voluntarily, based on their direct experiences in Judge Bryant's courtroom. I have documentation of these interviews, conducted with proper disclosure and consent." "Documentation you prepared," Kruger countered, "which could easily have been manipulated to support your vendetta against a respected jurist." "The witnesses are prepared to testify under oath," Usha replied evenly. "Perhaps the committee would like to hear directly from them?" Kruger's expression flickered briefly with unease. "That won't be necessary at this preliminary stage. We're merely determining whether there's sufficient cause for a formal disciplinary proceeding." "With respect," Usha said, placing subtle emphasis on a phrase that conveyed anything but, "if you're considering suspending my license based on unsubstantiated accusations, hearing from the alleged coached witnesses seems not only necessary, but fundamental to due process, a principle I'm sure this committee holds sacred." The strategic trap was set. If Kruger refused to hear from the witnesses, she would undermine the committee's credibility. If she allowed them to testify, their consistent and compelling accounts would devastate the narrative that Usha had manufactured their stories. After a tense consultation with the other committee members, Kruger announced with visible reluctance, "We will hear from one witness as a representative sample." Usha had anticipated this compromise. "I call Melanie Reynolds." Melanie's testimony was measured, specific, and devastating. She detailed her observations from years working in Bryant's courtroom, providing dates, case numbers, and precise descriptions of the judge's pattern of procedural manipulations. When Kruger attempted to suggest that Melanie was biased due to workplace grievances, the former clerk calmly produced her employment records showing exemplary evaluations until her transfer request following the Amanda Kim case. "And did Ms. Vance instruct you on what to say today?" Kruger asked, her frustration becoming evident. "Ms. Vance instructed me to tell the truth, nothing more," Melanie replied. "In fact, she specifically advised me to avoid speculation and limit my testimony to direct observations." By the hearing's conclusion, the committee's initial hostility had noticeably diminished. While they didn't dismiss the complaint entirely, political realities made that impossible. They declined to suspend Usha's license pending further investigation. Outside the hearing room, Brandon was waiting with news of his own. "The federal prosecutors from the Public Integrity Section just contacted me," he said once they were safely in his car. "They've opened a preliminary inquiry based on the financial patterns we exposed." "That's the breakthrough we needed," Usha said, relief evident in her voice for the first time in weeks. "Once federal authorities start subpoenaing records, Bryant's protection network won't be able to block access." Their cautious optimism was short-lived. That evening, as Amanda Kim left her apartment for a scheduled meeting with Chelsea Johnson, A black SUV with tinted windows pulled alongside her. Two men emerged, showing badges too quickly to identify. "Ms. Kim, we need you to come with us for questioning regarding potential perjury charges," one stated firmly. Amanda, remembering Usha's preparations for exactly this scenario, immediately began recording on her phone. "I'm happy to answer questions with my attorney present. Please identify yourselves properly and show me a warrant or subpoena." The men exchanged glances. "This isn't a formal arrest, ma'am. We're conducting a preliminary interview at District Attorney Vasquez's request." "Then I'll be glad to schedule that through proper channels," Amanda replied, her voice remarkably steady despite her fear. "Now, unless you're arresting me, I'll be continuing to my appointment." When the men moved to block her path, a nearby shop owner who had been watching the encounter called out, "Everything okay over there? I've got my camera going too." The men retreated to their vehicle, but not before one warned, "This isn't over. You're interfering with an official investigation." Amanda immediately called Usha, who arranged for Ryan Jenkins, a criminal defense attorney who had volunteered to help their cause, to meet her at Chelsea's apartment. The incident, while frightening, provided further evidence of the increasingly desperate measures Bryant's allies were employing. Similar intimidation attempts targeted other witnesses over the following days. Laura Sutton, another survivor whose case had been dismissed by Bryant, found her workplace suddenly subject to an aggressive tax audit. Thomas Hayes, the detective who had warned Usha, was reassigned to desk duty pending an internal investigation of alleged procedural violations. "They're getting desperate," Brandon observed during their nightly strategy session. "But that makes them more dangerous, not less." Usha nodded grimly. "We need to accelerate our timeline. The longer this drags, on the more opportunities they have to silence witnesses and bury evidence." Their chance came unexpectedly. Jacob Logan, a junior partner at Kyle Murphy's law firm, who had been present for several of the meetings captured on the security footage, contacted Brandon through an encrypted messaging app. "I can't be part of this anymore," his message read. "What they did to Amanda Kim and the others. I have documents. Bank records, meeting notes, strategy memos about which cases to bring before Bryant. I'll testify." Jacob's defection represented the first crack in Murphy's inner circle. As a direct participant in the conspiracy, his testimony and evidence would carry weight that even their strongest witnesses couldn't match. But it also raised the stakes dramatically. "They'll come after him with everything they have," Usha warned. When Brandon shared the news, character assassination, professional ruin, possibly even criminal charges for his role before he turned whistleblower. "He knows," Brandon replied. "He said he hasn't slept properly since watching Amanda's press conference. Said something about finally understanding what his father meant about the measure of a man being what he does when no one else would know." With Jacob's evidence in hand, properly documented and secured through legitimate legal channels, they finally had what they needed to approach federal authorities with a comprehensive case. The materials corroborated everything the security footage had shown, while providing the legally admissible evidence they had lacked. The decisive moment came when Usha and Brandon presented their findings to Elizabeth Martinez, the lead federal prosecutor assigned to the preliminary inquiry. After reviewing the documents for several hours, Martinez looked up with an expression of cold determination. "This goes beyond judicial misconduct," she said. "We're looking at a criminal enterprise operating within the court system, racketeering, conspiracy, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and what appears to be systematic civil rights violations in how certain cases were handled." "Will your office pursue charges?" Usha asked directly. Martinez's response was measured but encouraging. "I'll be presenting this to the grand jury next week. Based on what I'm seeing here, I expect to receive authorization for a full investigation with the complete resources of the Public Integrity Section." As they left the federal building, A weight seemed to lift from Usha's shoulders. For the first time since beginning this fight, the full machinery of justice was turning in their favor. But she knew better than to celebrate prematurely. "We need to prepare everyone for what comes next," she told Brandon. "Once Bryant and Murphy realize federal charges are imminent, they'll be cornered. That's when they're most likely to take extreme measures." Her prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. That night, Chelsea Johnson's apartment, where Amanda and several other survivors had been staying for safety, was broken into while empty. The intruders left no physical evidence, but their message was clear. They had found the survivors' safe haven. Simultaneously, a coordinated media campaign began, with commentators on local news questioning the politically motivated investigation and highlighting Judge Bryant's decades of distinguished service. Anonymous sources claimed that Usha's pursuit of the case stemmed from a personal vendetta after losing cases in Bryant's court. Most alarming was the news that Governor Todd Garcia, a longtime political ally of both Bryant and Murphy, had requested the state attorney general to review the federal investigation for potential jurisdictional overreach. "They're trying to build a firewall at the state level," Usha explained to their increasingly concerned team. "Create enough political pressure to slow or limit the federal investigation." "Can they do that?" Amanda asked. "They can certainly complicate things," Usha acknowledged. "But there's one thing they can't control anymore." "What's that?" "Public opinion," Brandon interjected. "Tomorrow's expose goes live at 6 a.m. across every platform simultaneously. National media outlets have already picked up on the brewing story. Once the details are public, containing this becomes infinitely harder for Bryant and his allies." The article, when published, exceeded even their expectations. Brandon had crafted a meticulous narrative that wove together court records, financial documents, witness testimonies, and Jacob Logan's insider account into an undeniable pattern of corruption. Most powerful were the personal stories of survivors like Amanda Kim, whose quest for justice had been systematically denied by the very institutions meant to protect them. Within hours, the story had gone national. Cable news networks dispatched reporters to cover the judicial scandal rocking the heartland. Social media exploded with the hashtag #JusticeForAmanda as thousands shared their own experiences with institutional betrayal. By noon, the governor's office issued a carefully worded statement expressing full confidence in federal authorities to investigate these concerning allegations. A clear retreat from the previous day's attempt to intervene. As public pressure mounted, the facade of unity among Bryant's allies began to crumble. Stephen Vasquez held a hastily arranged press conference to announce his recusal from any matters related to Judge Bryant due to an abundance of caution regarding the appearance of conflicts. While stopping short of admitting wrongdoing, his body language communicated clear distress as he refused to answer questions about his own appearances in the meetings documented by Jacob Logan. Kyle Murphy was less subtle. Spotted by reporters, as he attempted to board a private jet at the regional airport, he shouted, "No comment," before being whisked away by private security. Flight records later revealed the jet's destination as a small island nation known for its lack of extradition treaties. By evening, federal agents were seen entering Judge Bryant's chambers with boxes and evidence bags. The courthouse, which had witnessed so many perverted justice, was now the scene of justice's restoration. As Usha watched the coverage with Amanda and the other survivors, there was no celebration, only a quiet acknowledgement that their collective courage had finally forced a reckoning. The road ahead would still be difficult. Legal proceedings would take months, possibly years. The survivors would face continued scrutiny and questioning. The systems that had protected Bryant for so long would not transform overnight. But something fundamental had shifted. The wall of silence had been broken, and through that breach, the light of accountability now shone. "What happens next?" Amanda asked softly. "Justice," Usha replied. "Not perfect, not complete, but real. And the beginning of healing. For you, for the others, and for a system that failed its most sacred duty." As the sun set on a day that had changed everything, Usha knew their fight was far from over. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe they might actually win. The federal grand jury indictment landed like a thunderclap. Richard Bryant, Kyle Murphy, Stephen Vasquez, and 5 others charged with racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. The 87-page document detailed a criminal enterprise spanning more than a decade, systematically perverting the judicial system for financial gain and personal power. For Usha Vance, who had risked everything to expose the corruption, the indictment represented vindication, but also the beginning of an even more challenging phase of their struggle. As she gathered with Amanda Kim and the other survivors in Chelsea Johnson's newly secured office space, she carefully managed expectations. "This is a crucial step, but the fight is far from over," Usha explained. "The prosecution will face enormous pressure. The defense will have virtually unlimited resources. And most importantly, they'll target each of you with everything they have." Amanda nodded, her expression reflecting both determination and apprehension. "They'll try to discredit us, make the case about our credibility instead of their crimes." "Exactly," Usha confirmed, "which is why we need to prepare more thoroughly than we ever have before." Over the following weeks, their headquarters transformed into a war room. Melissa Williams, a former prosecutor who had quietly supported their efforts, now joined them openly to help prepare the survivors for the grueling testimony they would face. Each witness worked through mock cross-examinations designed to be even more brutal than what they would likely encounter in court. "Why did you wait so long to come forward?" Melissa demanded of Laura Sutton during one particularly intense session. Laura faltered, tears welling in her eyes. "Stop," Melissa said firmly. "They'll use emotion against you. Take a breath. Remember what we discussed about institutional barriers and systemic intimidation." Laura nodded, composed herself, and began again. "I reported through proper channels immediately. When those reports were ignored or suppressed, I faced a system designed to silence people like me. Without the support and protection now available through Ms. Vance's advocacy, coming forward meant risking my career, reputation, and personal safety with no guarantee of being heard." "Better," Melissa acknowledged, "but more specific. What exactly happened when you first reported?" These preparations continued daily, strengthening not only the survivors' testimonial resilience, but also the bonds between them. What had begun as isolated individuals fighting lonely battles had evolved into a formidable coalition with a shared purpose. Meanwhile, Bryant's defense team launched their expected counteroffensive. Michelle Kruger, now openly representing the former judge, held regular press briefings portraying Bryant as the victim of a witch hunt orchestrated by failed attorney Usha Vance. What we're witnessing is the weaponization of the justice system against a distinguished jurist whose only crime was upholding the law without political consideration, Kruger told reporters outside the federal courthouse. Judge Bryant made decisions based on evidence, not emotion or political pressure, exactly as our judicial system demands. The strategy was transparent but effective with certain audiences. Community opinion polarized, with Bryant's longtime supporters rallying to his defense while others expressed outrage at the scale of corruption revealed in the indictment. The most disturbing development came when several witnesses began receiving death threats. Melanie Reynolds found her car vandalized with the word liar scratched into the paint. Thomas Hayes, the detective who had warned Usha early in their investigation, discovered surveillance equipment installed outside his home. Federal marshals were assigned to protect key witnesses, transforming their lives into a high-security routine of safe houses and escorted movements. For Amanda and the other survivors, this added layer of restriction felt painfully familiar. Once again, they were the ones whose freedom was curtailed, while the accused maintained the pretense of normalcy. "It's not fair," Amanda confessed during a late-night conversation with Usha. "We did nothing wrong, yet we're the ones living like prisoners." "You're right," Usha acknowledged, refusing to offer empty reassurances. "It's not fair. The system still defaults to protecting the powerful, but what you're doing, what all of you are doing, is forcing that system to confront its failures. That never comes without cost." "I know," Amanda said quietly, "and I'm not giving up. I just need to acknowledge how hard this is sometimes." The pre-trial phase brought a series of legal battles as Bryant's team filed motion after motion to dismiss charges, suppress evidence, and disqualify witnesses. Each required careful response, consuming Usha's time and energy as she collaborated with the federal prosecutors led by Elizabeth Martinez. A potential setback emerged when Judge Heather Fisher was assigned to the case, a former colleague of Bryant's with concerning connections to several defendants. Usha and Martinez immediately filed a recusal motion based on conflict of interest. During the recusal hearing, Judge Fisher appeared visibly uncomfortable as Martinez methodically outlined the extensive personal and professional relationships that created, at minimum, the appearance of bias. "Your Honor," Martinez concluded, "the public's faith in these proceedings depends on absolute confidence in the court's impartiality. Given the documented connections between yourself and multiple defendants, we respectfully submit that your continued presence on this case would undermine that essential confidence." After a tense silence, Judge Fisher spoke. "While I reject the implication that I cannot be impartial, I recognize that the appearance of justice is as important as justice itself. I will recuse myself from these proceedings." The case was reassigned to Judge Nathan Thompson, a recently appointed federal judge with no discernible connections to any parties involved, a significant victory for the prosecution. As the trial date approached, an unexpected ally emerged. Michael Murray, Kyle Murphy's former financial controller, contacted federal prosecutors with additional evidence after learning of his former employer's attempt to flee the country. "I kept records of everything," Murray told Usha and Martinez during their initial meeting. "Insurance, I called it." Murphy had a system for flagging properties with legal complications that could be acquired below market value if the cases went to Bryant's court. The coding in our internal documents was explicit. BR approval meant Bryant had agreed to ensure a favorable outcome. Murray's documentation provided the missing link in their case, direct evidence of premeditated conspiracy rather than merely suspicious patterns. His testimony would demonstrate that the entire operation was designed with judicial corruption as its foundation. The breakthrough energized their team, but also intensified the opposition's desperation. Days before jury selection was scheduled to begin, Brandon Clark was arrested on charges of computer crimes related to illegally obtained evidence, a transparent attempt to discredit one of their most effective public voices. Usha immediately assembled a defense team for Brandon, led by Morgan McGee, a prominent civil rights attorney. At Brandon's arraignment, Morgan systematically dismantled the charging document, pointing out that it failed to specify any actual criminal act while relying entirely on innuendo and association. "Your Honor," Morgan argued, "the prosecution has presented no evidence that my client hacked, stole, or improperly obtained any information. He published verified information provided by sources, exactly as protected by both journalistic privilege and the First Amendment. This arrest represents nothing less than an attempt to silence reporting on matters of profound public interest. The judge, noting the prosecution's inability to articulate specific criminal actions, released Brandon on his own recognizance, while ordering prosecutors to provide a more definitive charging document within 10 days, a deadline they ultimately failed to meet, resulting in dismissal of the charges. With jury selection finally underway, Usha observed from the gallery as Martinez skillfully identified and challenged jurors with connections to Bryant, Murphy, or their various enterprises. The defense, led by Michelle Kruger, fought to exclude jurors with backgrounds similar to the survivors, arguing they would be inherently biased against the defendants. After 2 grueling weeks, a jury of 9 women and 3 men was empaneled, representing diverse backgrounds and experiences. As the trial proper began, the courthouse became the focal point of national attention, with daily demonstrations supporting the survivors and demanding accountability. Elizabeth Martinez's opening statement laid out the prosecution's case with devastating clarity. This trial is about the systematic corruption of justice itself. The evidence will show that Judge Richard Bryant, in conspiracy with developer Kyle Murphy and others, transformed his courtroom from a place of justice into a marketplace where favorable rulings could be purchased, where survivors of abuse could be silenced, and where the rule of law was subordinated to personal profit. Kruger's opening for the defense focused on attacking the credibility of key witnesses while portraying Bryant as a by-the-book jurist whose rulings were always supported by legal precedent. The prosecution wants you to see conspiracy where there was only coincidence, corruption where there was only careful judicial consideration, she told the jury. They have built their case on the testimony of disgruntled employees, failed litigants, and an attorney with a personal vendetta against Judge Bryant. As the prosecution began presenting evidence, Amanda Kim was called as their first witness. Usha watched with a mixture of pride and concern as Amanda took the stand, facing not only the jury, but also, for the first time since her case was dismissed, Judge Bryant himself. Martinez guided Amanda through her testimony with precision, establishing the details of her original case, the overwhelming evidence that was systematically excluded or undermined in Bryant's court, and the devastating impact of the dismissal on her life and recovery. "Ms. Kim," Martinez asked near the conclusion of her direct examination, "why did you choose to come forward as part of this case, knowing the personal cost you would likely face?" Amanda's gaze shifted briefly to where Usha sat, drawing strength from her presence before addressing the jury directly. "Because the system failed me, and I knew it was failing others. Because silence only protects the powerful. Because truth matters, especially when, powerful people try to bury it." Kruger's cross-examination was every bit as aggressive as they had anticipated, attempting to portray Amanda as emotionally unstable and financially motivated. But the months of preparation had served their purpose. Amanda remained composed, addressing even the most pointed questions with clarity and dignity. "No, Ms. Kruger," she responded to one particularly inflammatory question. "I am not confused about what happened in Judge Bryant's courtroom. The transcript reflects exactly what I've testified to today. The evidence that was excluded is documented in the court record. These aren't matters of perception or interpretation, they're matters of fact." As Amanda stepped down, several jurors nodded slightly, a small but significant indication that her testimony had resonated. The pattern continued as other survivors testified, each sharing their experience of justice denied in Bryant's courtroom. The defense fought vigorously to undermine each witness, But the consistent pattern across so many cases proved difficult to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. The prosecution's case strengthened further when Jacob Logan took the stand, providing insider testimony about the explicit coordination between Murphy, Bryant, and Vasquez. His documentation of specific meetings, decisions, and financial arrangements directly contradicted the defense's portrayal of independent actions. It was understood, Jacob testified, that certain cases would receive special handling in Judge Bryant's court. We maintained separate files for these cases with different preparation standards and success expectations. The process was never explicitly stated in writing, but it was clearly communicated and universally understood within our team. The most dramatic testimony came from Michael Murray, who presented the internal coding system that had flagged properties for what he called the Bryant treatment. His meticulous financial records demonstrated that properties acquired following favorable rulings in Bryant's court had generated over $40 million in profits for Murphy's companies, with documented payments to shell companies linked to Bryant totaling nearly $5 million. As Michael Murray's devastating testimony concluded, the defense team appeared visibly shaken. What had begun as confident dismissal of the allegations had transformed into desperate damage control. During cross-examination, Kruger attempted to portray Murray as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but his detailed documentation withstood every challenge. "These records weren't created after the fact, Ms. Kruger," Murray explained calmly. "They were maintained contemporaneously. As part of my professional responsibility as financial controller, every transaction is dated, documented, and corroborated by bank records that your clients believed were untraceable." The prosecution's case continued to build methodically over the following weeks. Melanie Reynolds provided compelling testimony about the procedural manipulations she had witnessed in Bryant's courtroom. Thomas Hayes revealed how police investigations that might have implicated Murphy's associates were consistently reassigned or deprioritized following interventions from District Attorney Vasquez. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of Leslie Porter, a former clerk in the county recorder's office, who detailed how property records for transactions involving Murphy's companies were deliberately misfiled or delayed in processing to obscure the connections between the different entities involved. In the scheme, there was a specific protocol for these files. Leslie testified they would be marked for special processing and held until Mr. Vasquez's office approved their filing. Sometimes they would be deliberately miscategorized to make them difficult to locate in public searches. As the prosecution's case neared its conclusion, Elizabeth Martinez called her final witness, Usha Vance. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Usha approached the stand. For months, she had been the architect of the case against Bryant and his co-conspirators, working tirelessly behind the scenes while facing professional exile and personal threats. Now, she would finally speak directly to the jury. Martinez began by establishing Usha's professional background and the circumstances that led her to investigate Judge Bryant's pattern of dismissals. "Ms. Vance, what initially drew your attention to cases in Judge Bryant's court?" Martinez asked. "Statistical anomalies," Usha replied, her voice clear and measured. "As an attorney representing survivors, I noticed that cases with similar evidence profiles had dramatically different outcomes depending on which judge presided. Cases in Judge Bryant's court involving properties of interest to Murphy Development Group were dismissed at a rate that defied coincidence." "And what did you do with this observation?" "I began systematically reviewing case records, looking for patterns in judicial reasoning, procedural decisions, and ultimate outcomes. The pattern that emerged was consistent. Cases that might impede Murphy's business interests received what I can only describe as procedural sabotage. evidence excluded on technicalities, witness testimony undermined through irregular questioning, time limitations imposed on prosecution but not defense. Martinez guided Usha through the evolution of her investigation, from initial pattern recognition to the formation of their coalition of witnesses and experts. Throughout her testimony, Usha maintained the same calm precision that had characterized her entire approach to the case. When Kruger rose for cross-examination, her strategy was clear: portray Usha as an embittered crusader with a personal vendetta. Ms. Vance, isn't it true that your own cases before Judge Bryant were consistently unsuccessful? Kruger began. I appeared before Judge Bryant 3 times, Usha acknowledged. In each case, the pattern of procedural irregularities I've described was present. So this entire investigation stems from your personal frustration with losing cases. No, Usha replied firmly. It stems from a pattern of injustice that affected dozens of survivors and property owners across hundreds of cases. My personal experience merely helped me recognize what the data was already showing. Kruger's questioning grew increasingly aggressive, but Usha remained unflappable, repeatedly redirecting attention from personal attacks to the documented evidence of corruption. When Kruger attempted to suggest that Usha had coached witnesses to embellish their testimony, Usha calmly referred to the extensive documentation of their interview protocols. Every conversation with potential witnesses was recorded with their consent, Ms. Kruger. Those recordings have been provided to the court. If you can identify a single instance of my suggesting testimony or encouraging embellishment, I welcome you to present it. By the time Usha was excused from the stand, Kruger's frustration was palpable. The defense's strategy of discrediting witnesses had gained little traction against the mountain of documentation, financial records, and consistent testimony the prosecution had assembled. With both sides having presented their cases, the trial moved to closing arguments. Elizabeth Martinez delivered a powerful summation, methodically connecting the evidence to each charge in the indictment, while emphasizing the human cost of the defendant's corruption. This case has never been merely about financial crimes or procedural violations, she told the jury. At its heart, it's about the betrayal of sacred trust. Judge Bryant swore an oath to uphold justice impartially. Mr. Vasquez promised to represent the people's interests faithfully. Mr. Murphy and his associates exploited that betrayal for profit. But the true victims were people like Amanda Kim, survivors, who came to our justice system at their most vulnerable, only to find that system corrupted against them. Kruger's closing argument attempted to introduce reasonable doubt by suggesting alternative explanations for the documented patterns: judicial discretion rather than corruption, business acumen rather than conspiracy, unfortunate coincidences rather than coordinated action. The prosecution wants you to see monsters where there are only men making difficult decisions in complex situations, she argued. They've constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory by connecting unrelated events and assigning sinister motives to routine judicial and business practices. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. As the courtroom fell silent, the 4 women rose to deliver their verdict. On the count of racketeering conspiracy, we find the defendant, Richard Bryant, guilty. The litany of guilty verdicts continued across all major charges for Bryant, Murphy, and Vasquez, with varying outcomes for the lesser defendants. As the judge thanked the jury for their service and remanded the guilty parties into custody pending sentencing, Amanda Kim reached for Usha's hand, tears streaming silently down her face. It's really over, she whispered. This part is, Usha replied gently. Now the healing and rebuilding begins. The aftermath of the verdict brought sweeping changes. A comprehensive review of all cases handled by Bryant during his tenure was ordered, with priority given to cases involving survivors of abuse whose claims had been dismissed. The State Judicial Ethics Committee, under new leadership, implemented enhanced disclosure requirements and monitoring protocols for judges with potential conflicts of interest. Most significantly, a survivor advocacy office was established within the court system, providing independent oversight and support for those navigating the often traumatic process of seeking justice. At the survivors' insistence, it was named the Vance Initiative for Judicial Accountability, 6 months after the verdict. As the dust began to settle, Usha gathered with Amanda and the other survivors who had become the core of their movement. What had begun as a desperate fight against seemingly insurmountable corruption had transformed into a nationwide advocacy network supporting judicial reform and survivor-centered justice. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Amanda said, as they shared a celebratory dinner. "So many others are still fighting their own versions of our battle, often without the resources or platform we eventually found." Usha nodded. "The systemic issues extend far beyond Bryant's courtroom. What we uncovered was extreme, but the underlying vulnerabilities exist throughout the system. That's why I want to go to law school," Amanda continued, a new confidence in her voice. "I want to do what you did, use the law to protect those the system fails." Around the table, others shared their own plans. Melanie Reynolds had accepted a position developing ethical guidelines for court employees. Laura Sutton was working with legislators to strengthen protections for whistleblowers. Chelsea Johnson's advocacy organization had expanded to 3 new cities. As Usha looked around at these women who had transformed from victims to advocates, from survivors to leaders, she felt a profound sense of vindication, not just in the legal victory they had achieved, but in the community they had built and the changes they were creating. The fight against Judge Richard Bryant had never been solely about exposing one corrupt judge. It had been about challenging the systems that enabled such corruption to flourish, about giving voice to those who had been silenced, and about demonstrating that even the most entrenched power could be held accountable when enough courageous individuals stood together. In the years that followed, as the Vance Initiative expanded its reach and impact, journalists would often ask Usha if she had known from the beginning what her investigation would uncover, if she had anticipated the scale of corruption or the significance of its exposure. Her answer was always the same. "I didn't know what we would find, only that the silence surrounding these cases was too consistent to be coincidental. Justice requires us to question patterns that comfort the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It requires us to listen to survivors, especially when systems are designed to silence them." The legacy of their fight extended far beyond the specific case or courtroom. It became a blueprint for accountability, a testament to the power of collective action, and a reminder that justice, while not always swift or certain, remains possible even against the most formidable opposition if enough people refuse to be silenced. For Amanda Kim and the other survivors whose courage had made it all possible, the greatest victory wasn't just the guilty verdict or the institutional reforms that followed. It was the reclamation of their voices, the transformation of their trauma into a force for change, and the knowledge that their experiences, once dismissed in a corrupt judge's courtroom, had ultimately helped make the whole nation listen.